if the audience didn't understand what you were talking about with megatrends, I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on them. When I think of megatrends, I think some of them are things such as food and water shortages, demographic shifts to urbanization, this growing income equality and the decline of the middle class that we're seeing, impact of technology disruptions, climate change, etc. And then this huge rise of pandemics because we're infringing on environments now that we've never touched before, which is opening us up to lots of new diseases and other things. So this is all what you mention is this intertidal. And to me, I'm a big believer in social impact theory, which is that history repeats itself. Yep. And you mentioned earlier about going 400 years back. And I think about the time when we were back at the printing press, and people at that time were mostly tradesmen. You had blacksmiths and et cetera. And I think we're going right back in that direction because we're entering this time where if people are not seeing the reality of it, 400 to 700 million jobs are going to be displaced, which means you're going to have no other choice but to relearn and do it on a much more frequent basis. So I think what's happening to us now that is so different is you've got all these megatrends, but they're all colliding. And it's creating these huge shifts in what you describe in the book as an earthquake. And so my whole thought process around this is how do we shift this mindset of individualism that is causing many of these megatrends to occur and has permeated society to one of transgenerational concern? And what are the steps that you outline to do that?
So all the mega trends you list are many of the ones that we also think about, and you are correct in that many of the mega trends. But by the way, mega trends are not necessarily. Oh, we should almost see them as in some way somewhat neutral, right? Because they can be positive or negative. Increased urbanization could lead to a decreased carbon footprint as a society, but it also leads to other things. So they can go up and down in terms of their impact. Your analysis is correct. The question, which is, how do we shift from a me culture to a we culture, right? It's like literally just literally switching the M upside down becomes a W. And your analysis is correct. And then, so what I want to add is a historical component. Remember, I talked earlier about the past 400 years, kind of breaking things down from very complex systems to their individual components. Well, that also happened in terms of where we put the priority as a species in terms of how we function. So what that means is we over-indexed on hyper-individualism. We saw the society that we live in as not this kind of interconnected lattice, but much more as these individual parts, called basically John's life, Ari's life, Sharon's life. And we broke down to this me culture, which in a sense is part of kind of the archetype of the best. It's rugged individualism. And by the way, for what it's worth, we needed to break the collective lattice that we had through the Middle Ages, especially in the global North and the West, was driven by the church. And I don't mean this as a kind of a theological critique, but as if you think of the church as like the all-consuming power structure for several hundred years in the West, what it meant was everything you did was on or for their behalf, and there was no individualism or no individual autonomy. And so the Enlightenment kind of broke that up and allowed us to be individual actors, which was great because then John could pursue his interests, Ari could pursue his interests. But what we lost when we threw the baby out with the bathwater was a collective sense of meaning and purpose. And so what you're arguing for, as I am too, is how do we still maintain individual agency, autonomy, and intentionality, but nested within this kind of lattice or matrix of all of us working towards something bigger than just our own selves, right? And so the mega trends that we are looking at in many ways are manifestations of this hyper individualized thinking, right? That's where these things came up from. Because I can tell you a lot of the mega trends that we're dealing with right now, if it was a society that was more focused on collective as opposed to solely individual flourishing, we wouldn't have so many of these negative knock-on effects. So the question is, as you said, if we're in this intertidal moment and we're dealing with these megatrends, how do we have a mindset that shifts us from me to we? So in many ways, I think Long Path is answering. It's developing a sense of transgenerational empathy for not just past and future, but for the present. And part of empathy for the present is not just about yourself. So it's not just self-compassion and awareness for Ari or for John, but it's for those around us who are all going through this at the same time. And so what long path thinking and acting does, and in many ways, kind of what you're getting at is living long path, is takes us out of these individualized silos that make these megatrends become overly negative and turn them into positive, right? So it gets us actually thinking from a space of how do we all flourish in the present as opposed to just compete with one another, which is that competing with one another, that like free market on overdrive, which is the natural manifestation of the past 400 years. How do we start to turn that? So we start thinking about kind of, instead of living an extractive life, so we see each other as things to extract from, and one that's more regenerative and building towards futures that we want. And I think that within the book, that's in many ways what those exercises are meant to kind of cultivate. Kind of, when we think about the gardening metaphor again, is living like that.